Perfume on the radio.
On lookout FM.
Welcome to Perfume on the Radio. This is a bi-monthly program presented by the Institute for Art and Olfaction. If you don't know about us, we're a nonprofit organization devoted to experimentation and access in the field of perfumery, and we're based here in the always sunny Los Angeles, where the people are beautiful and the smells are plentiful. I'm Saskia Wilson-Brown, and I'll be hosting today's episode. We recorded this episode in January and February of 2021, and because of COVID, we've been very limited by the tools at hand. For that reason, the audio is not always as stellar as we'd like, but I hope we make up for it in the complexity and intelligence of our guests. In today's episode, we go a little bit deeper into the relationship between scent and the perceptions of the other. This is the second episode of a two-part investigation into scent and social structure, and in part one, we explored class structures through the lens of perfumery. You can find it on our archive at perfumeontheradio.com. In this episode, we have four wonderful guests. Nuri McBride will start us off by sharing her research into olfactory disgust and how it has manifested in history and culture. Academic Hsuan L, based in Davis, will then join us to talk about his work on olfactory risk in life and literature, and he'll be followed by Hugo Boss Prize-winning artist Anicka Yi discussing how she uses scent in her arts practice in order to tackle xenophobia, sexism, and other difficult topics. Closing out the episode, Identity Narrative co-founder Mary Richardson-Lowry will talk about the joy and growth that comes from encountering difference. This episode explores tough and painful issues. It's not an easy topic to engage with, and some parts of this episode might be upsetting for some of our listeners. So I just want to start off by letting you know that we are discussing these questions in a spirit of justice, and because we believe that shifting hurtful, fearful, dehumanizing narratives sometimes requires addressing the ugliness head-on. I hope you get something out of this, and please don't hesitate to email us at hello@artandolfaction.com if you have any thoughts or feedback. So with that said, I'm your host, Saskia Wilson-Brown, and this is Perfume on the Radio, Episode 4, Embodied Aromatics. Let's get started. We heard from our first guest, Nuri McBride, in Episode 2, Questions of Class. To refresh your memory, Nuri is an activist, writer, perfumer, and academic. You can learn more about her work at nurimcbride.com, and she joined us from her home in Haifa, Israel. Well, so welcome, Nuri, and thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
As you know, we've been discussing class and its relationship to perfume. So are there any examples of people speaking of the lower classes on olfactory terms that you can tell us about?
Speaking about scent and especially bodily odors and environmental odors in class structures is actually extremely common. It's a trope within Victorian literature describing lower class Brits in Britain in a very negative olfactive way. It's almost always when you're talking about the lower classes and it's negative. George Orwell, he's sort of famous for saying, the smell of the lower classes and having the very strong trope of olfactive disgust for poverty and working class people. And it's something that runs throughout characters in a lot of his stories. It's not just in fiction and literature. It's part of the narratives that we have around class structures and olfaction, whether we're talking about Bukhari Jews in Uzbekistan, whether we're talking about the scheduled castes, the caste and tribal systems that are outside of the traditional system within India. Olfactive aversions are brought up as a reason why these people are less than. So it's very common.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Are there any more recent sort of examples that you can think of?
If you look at the news coverage of the detention centers for migrants along the border, those environments, have been very poorly regulated for the most part, and there is septic tank issues. And the way that is presented in the news is as a burden to the essentially middle class communities that they're near. Not that these individuals have been put into a situation where they can't maintain hygienic standards. And that's always how scent is really used as a tool of oppression when you use this kind of language. It's really it's kind of a neoliberal concept of putting the responsibility on the individual instead of the group. For instance, if you see a homeless person on the street, instead of saying, what did we do as a society to fail this person? It's framing the question as, how did this person fail? And that's part of that othering, that pushing away of the narrative that they're not us, they're not in our group class. And that kind of gets used as a sort of a natural, quote unquote, natural reasoning for why they're different. And, a great example of this in recent cinema is Parasite. It's a fantastic movie where class tensions are really played out through smells.
And what happens in Parasite, just for those who haven't possibly seen it?
So I don't want to give up the story. It is an adventure. I highly recommend going to see it, but it is a story of a working class family that has had financial troubles, that live in a below ground apartment. The story begins with street fumigators accidentally fumigating their house, kind of imbuing them and their garments with a particular odor. Some hijinks ensue where they all sort of get involved with working for this very wealthy upper class family. And even though they are putting on this guise of sophistication and upward mobility and trying to bridge this gap and make a better life for themselves, their smell of their poverty stays with them. It's something they can't overcome. And it's also something that is met with repulsion by the wealthy family that they work for. It's a very powerful symbolism for class structure in South Korea today.
Yeah, I remember in the movie, I think at some point, without giving it away towards the end, the wealthy family father or mother is something overtly talks about the smell of this working class family as a quite negative thing.
And it's interesting that doesn't happen until the end, because it's something that it's very present that it's happening throughout. And it's only when they're kind of pushed into this corner that it becomes vocalized. But the aversion and the sort of disdain and distrust around these odors associated with poverty is running throughout it. And I think that was a really excellent use of scent in cinema to portray something within a story.
Yeah, 100%. So you've spoken about Orwell, you've spoken about Parasite. Are there any other examples you can think of sort of how this has been manifested in cinema or literature or art even?
There was a wonderful story that came out fairly recently called Smell and Stench that was specifically dealing with scent aversion in India for Indian children that were facing prejudice from their teachers. It was part of a collection of stories called Two Named Boys and Other Stories. And Smell and Stench was one of them that was really addressing the issue of scent persecution and class persecution within India, and explaining it to children in a way that children could understand, that you can wash and wash and wash. It doesn't matter. It's not really about how you smell. It's how the narrative around how your community is supposed to smell that matters. Also, there was a great book, Sonala Ibrahim's book, That Smell, and Notes from Prison. And scent also plays a really interesting role in talking about kind of class hypocrisy, prison and oppression, and a system that is harmful to its own residents is kind of the fart in the room that no one wants to address, but it's there and we all smell it. And that's kind of becomes a big part of that story. And it was quite a controversial book. It was banned for many years and was seen as vulgar in Arabic literature for a long time. But it's I think a really seminal work on class and political unrest in Egypt. And it's in English now, so it's more accessible to people.
It is interesting how these aromatic associations become so entrenched in xenophobic language as well. Certainly the situation we are in the US right now, at least, one can practically smell the olfactory disdain, and I'm talking from the part of the affluent liberals thinking about the Trump followers, the quote deplorables. I'm not a Trump fan, to be very clear, but there is this sort of classist narrative that's happening there as well.
Absolutely. And it's really actually in the United States, I think in that narrative in particular, it's hard to talk about the differences between class and xenophobia and racism because they're so intertwined in that environment. They're extremely intertwined. And I mean, part of it is coming to the reckoning that racism, just like olfactive oppression to a lesser extent, are tools of an economic oppression. And so is classism. And that it's used as methods of othering, of separating, to keep people different, to not see themselves reflected in another group of people, but instead to have allegiances elsewhere. So I think especially right now, you see a lot of white people who are really trying to other what happened at the Capitol recently. Those are the other white people, as opposed to being like, no, you really need to sit in this moment and recognize that even though it is absolutely disgusting what they did, that it's part of a bigger system that hurts people. And othering it is really just about comforting yourself and saying, I'm not like them, as opposed to saying we're all part of a system that has done bad things and has really hurt people. It can be very difficult to parse those things as separate, but there's a very strong class element to racial prejudice in America. And scent gets used to justify both of them. It's a language of justification.
And I'm gathering has been for a long time.
Absolutely. There's a really great book that just came out called The Smell of Slavery that talks about how Europeans needed to kind of justify to themselves the violence that they were committing to Black and African individuals. They needed to justify that by making the people they were harming seem as unhuman as possible. Talking about scent, that this was base scent, that they had these animalistic scents, they didn't smell like me, was a way of saying that on a fundamental level, they aren't me. And you see it reflected in minstrel songs. You see it in folklore. You see it in stories that are written at the time, and in a lot of the kind of tropes of prejudice that carry on to today. Kids are still getting sent home from school with notes by teachers saying that their hair smells. And it's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. But it comes from these deep-seated tropes of othering and of pushing away and saying, no, you're different. And it's really a way for those who are the implementers of violence in that environment to say, I can do this because they're not human. And that's always a dangerous place to be in. And
so what are the philosophical underpinnings that support this? Is this related, do you think, to the hierarchy of the senses? Smell being the more sort of, the basest of the senses is, was it Plato or Kant? I can't remember. Someone said.
Yeah, I mean, both Plato and Kant really were not huge fans of scent. And it's something that within Western philosophy has been argued for many years. It was seen as being this very primitive sense. It was this vision and hearing were these sophisticated higher order senses that you could get true knowledge from. But odor was, to the ground, it was animalistic, it was primitive, and therefore you couldn't get real knowledge from it. Of course, scent is a form of communication, and we communicate through scent all the time. The very idea of perfume is a form of communication, whether to yourself or to other people. I'm clean, I'm sexy, I'm this, I'm that you're broadcasting that kind of emotional response you want people to have with you when you put on a fragrance. That's communication. So it's not true, but this was something that was held for a really long period of time, and that continued on into how we talked about scent and scent cultures. And, you had Freud, who was not a huge fan of the nose. And this idea that if you were interested in scent, it was because you were not this sophisticated, intellectual, elevated human, that you were somehow base or primitive or more animal-like, because this is an animalistic thing. And even Charles Darwin thought that eventually human beings would lose their sense of smell because it was so, quote unquote, not valuable to us. So it's coming out of this hierarchy of the senses that scent altogether gets sort of a bad rap. And you see this a lot with Orientalism in fragrance. If you have a group of people who have an olfactive culture that isn't as disconnected from scent, like areas of the Levant in the Middle East, like areas of Asia, where you have rituals like using incense in temples or using bahur or things like this, it becomes something you use against people.
That was Nuri McBride. You can learn more about her work at nurimcbride.com. Our next guest is Hsuan L. Hsu. Hsuan's an academic at UC Davis teaching a course on literature with a focus on BIPOC authors from North America. His recent book, The Smell of Risk, focuses on the uneven distribution of environmental risk with an emphasis on the sense of smell, and was published by New York University Press in 2020. I started our conversation by asking Hsuan how he came to work with scent and how he started to explore the concepts of olfactory risk. Here's Hsuan.
I got interested in studying smell because it's the most exposed sense, right? So our olfactory system is directly exposed to the environment. It's a sense where you lose control of the boundaries of your bodies. In order to smell something, you have to take it into your body. And so there's an inherent risk that's involved with smell. I mean, we're seeing this so much with COVID right now, right? So if you inhale and you smell what might be a human smell and you're not in your house, then, our response to that is going to involve a sense of risk. But then risk itself is unevenly distributed. So different parts of cities have more and less access to green space, more and less exposure to incinerators, freeways, sewage smells, and so forth. And of course, these things map very much onto class and race disparities.
Yeah.
I'm interested in smell because it's a sense that allows us, at least much of the time, to perceive these changes in the air. And it's also a sense that at the moment that you perceive those changes, you're also taking them in and putting yourself perhaps at risk.
So you spoke about how olfactory risk was unevenly distributed and that it mapped with racial disparity in the real world. I'm curious if this also comes up in your literary research.
I definitely see a lot of examples of smell largely correlating with racial disparities. For example, I read a couple of stories that are set in Harlem, whether it's the smells of actual apartments and things are kind of coming into the apartment from the air shaft, or it's the smell of, in Ann Petry's novel, The Street, the custodian is often going to the basement to fill the furnace, and someone tells him that he has mold growing on him. And I imagine that also is mold going into his lungs. And as someone with asthma, I know what that feels like. So there are a lot of moments like this where you get descriptions of the smells of the streets of Harlem. They happen right next to crime scenes. And we all know about smells kind of deep ties to the centers of emotion, the ways that smell can kind of trigger involuntary memories, involuntary emotional responses, and so forth. So it provides a kind of social and even an urban planning context for these kinds of moments of what I call olfactory intoxication, where you're taking in things that are toxic from the air.
So, Hsuan, you've also written and spoken a lot about the impact of colonization on indigenous smellscapes. And I'm wondering, could you tell us a little bit more about your research in that realm?
Yeah, so there I'm drawing from the work of the Southern Paiute scholar Kristen Simmons, who has this essay called Settler Atmospheric. So she's interested in settler colonialism, and I should probably explain that term. So it's a mode of colonialism that involves taking and settling on the lands of the people that are being colonized. So it's a mode of colonialism that is kind of active throughout the continental United States. We might think too of Australia, Canada. So settler colonialism transforms the atmosphere, right? So she's talking about her experience as a water defender at the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. And there she talks about how helicopters, tear gas, these kinds of things all maintain an atmosphere of oppression that kind of creates this mood, right? It's aimed to sort of depress one's mood and constrain what's possible for individual bodies and for kind of the crowd. I got interested in thinking about this in terms of smell specifically. So thinking about how colonialism has changed smellscapes. So kind of like landscapes and the smells of those landscapes, especially around writings about plants, right? So if you think about invasive plants introduced by colonists, if you think about monocrop agriculture, so like huge plantations or giant corporate farms, what that does to the smells that once belonged in the landscape, and also what those indigenous smells mean for indigenous people, for their ceremonies, practices, and their modes of relating to the environment and to the world. Indigenous people, at least the ones that I was reading. So for example, the Potawatomi plant scientist Robin Wall Kimmerer, her amazing smell-oriented book, Braiding Sweetgrass. She talks about how she understands smell almost like as a mode of interspecies communication, where the plant reaches out to people, kind of calls people to it, and the people harvest the plant in a responsible way that actually allows the plant to flourish and propagate, while also weaving baskets and incorporating the plant as the kind of center of ceremonies and so forth. So just an entirely different way of relating to smell that, of course, has also been colonized, right? So that's the other layer of colonialism. It doesn't just change what smells are in the air, for example, smog, or the smell of pesticides or golf courses instead of the smells of, indigenous plants. It also changes how we value smell.
Yeah. Hsuan, you mentioned settler colonialism. Are there other forms of colonialism, just for clarity?
So think of, say, the British in India, right? That's a mode of colonialism whose goal is not to send British people to settle the land and start farming the land themselves. It's a mode of colonialism that involves kind of extracting resources and wealth from the locals and from their labor. So it's still premised on exploiting the land and the people, but it's doing it in a very different mode. And the main difference there is that it doesn't necessarily involve genocide, because it's not about attempting to erase the people from the land and attempting to kind of erase their ways of living.
Okay. Do you think that globalization is changing how we relate to culturally specific smells?
That's a great question. And I mean, I have only a preliminary answer, which would be yes, right? I mean, and I think so some ways it's doing that is it's hugely broadening the scope of smells that people have access to and have a kind of rudimentary knowledge about, right? So you might be able to identify the smell of Tahitian vanilla or Kona coffee, right, in a way that one would never have experienced in an earlier era. So I think that people have access to a lot more smells, but I think that that also means that there's a much less connected relationship to particular smells. I mean, you could imagine someone might really be attracted to the smell of Tahitian vanilla, but it's coming from a completely different place, and it involves modes of extraction that, the consumer probably knows very little about. So a lot of knowledge is actually obscured by that relationship of kind of like a bourgeois favorite smell. Whereas in Robin Wall Kimmerer, the smell of sweetgrass is this kind of locally specific smell that humans have both a relationship with and a responsibility towards. You could argue that globalization has created this much larger scope of more shallow smell olfactory relationships.
Yeah. Okay, so switching gears a bit, Hsuan, I'd be curious about your thoughts on olfactory nuisance complaints. And an example that comes to mind from recent memory is the case made against the producers of Sriracha hot sauce here in LA. So on the one hand, that's a functional example of a community revolt against smell pollution, because the residents complained of, headaches and burning eyes from the nearby hot sauce factory. On the other hand, the press coverage around the lawsuit reads as pretty xenophobic. For instance, they clearly state in many articles that this is a, quote, Asian hot sauce. And indeed, the owner of the company, David Tran, is an ethnic Chinese immigrant from Vietnam. So what do you make of these sorts of complaints?
Yeah, so there are a lot of olfactory nuisance complaints, and disproportionately they seem to be targeted towards ethnic practices ethnic restaurants, especially, right? So I found quite a few that were directed at South Asian and Chinese restaurants. There was a case where a Chinese restaurant was, there were complaints against it because it was burning wood, but then the pizza restaurant, I forget if it's next door or nearby, was also burning wood. So they just made an argument that the Chinese restaurant smells were more of a nuisance, because they were not part of the community or something like this.
That's crazy. Yeah.
So I think that of course, both of those could, there could be a kind of toxicity involved with either of those examples. And so it's not to say that sriracha is safe, right? That their production practices were necessarily safe or non-toxic, but there's so many other toxic emissions, within communities in LA, and there are no complaints or not many complaints, or they're not enforced against those. I have a whole chapter in the book about cultural prejudice against Asian smells. There's a long history of associating the Chinese with overcrowded buildings, the smells of opium, the smells of unregulated industry, or squid fishing in Monterey, which is actually another case of this kind of nuisance regulation. And we could see a version of that with the COVID pandemic again, right? Where Asians are perceived as this kind of deviant and dangerous envelope of air, not just a kind of different looking body, but a pocket of air that could kind of enter one's body and transform one in ways that are unthinkable.
Yeah. Switching gears again, Hsuan, sorry. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about olfactory art. So you make a connection between your work researching and studying olfactory risk and this movement in contemporary art known as olfactory art, for lack of a better term. So how did you come to draw these connections?
I was really interested in atmospheres or air that could be risky and toxic. And it occurred to me when I was walking around the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art that the air in the museum is just the most controlled air imaginable. The temperature is carefully regulated, particulates carefully surveilled. It's air that's optimized for the art. And this is part of why, like, a curator friend of mine told me that olfactory art is just a curator's nightmare, right? Like, if you're trying to put it in a museum, it's just going to lead to all kinds of issues and problems that you have to deal with. And fundamentally, the museum's air either can't or can barely accommodate olfactory art. So that was really interesting to me. But then just thinking about it a bit more broadly, olfactory art has a completely different model of the body than kind of conventional visual art, say a sculpture or a painting, right? Where the first rule is don't touch it, don't interact with it physically. Olfactory art is premised on that kind of physical interaction.
Yeah, it's hard for the curators. But I also often feel sort of empathy with attendees because they have no choice in the matter. They walk into the gallery or the museum and they're participants whether they like it or not. And, you can put a sign up and control airflow, to a degree. But there is a little potential for a wild card when working with scent. And there's a question of agency there, which I find pretty interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And I do think it's really important to have kind of content warnings, literal content warnings, right? Because the content will become your content. But I do think, I've seen different kinds of technologies of distribution for olfactory art. And I do think that museums do, it does kind of still get out in small amounts, but they seem to do a reasonably good job of trying to keep it local or exhibiting it outside the museum, things like this.
Are there any olfactory artists working right now that you find particularly fascinating, given your range of interests?
Yeah, so I write in the book quite a bit about Sean Raspit, Peter de Couperet, Boris Rowe. I guess I'll talk a bit more about Anicka Yi. So Anicka Yi's Guggenheim exhibition, Life is Cheap, where she hits visitors immediately, talking about the kind of like direct exposure of visitors, with these gas canisters that are emitting a smell, right? That, if I'm remembering right, the smell consists of scents that were sourced from New York City's Chinatown and Koreatown neighborhoods, and also from ants. So there's an ant colony that features in one of her other dioramas. So it's this kind of smell that crosses species. And for most visitors, it crosses racial lines. And it just directly exposes visitors to the smell before they see the rest of the exhibition. So the idea is that it actually could change their mental, emotional state, perhaps even their visual kind of perception. They then go in and there's two dioramas, one involving bacterial cultures, also sourced from Chinatown and Koreatown, and one involving those ants that they have already kind of smelled, right? So it's this really fascinating scenario for the exhibition that really pushes visitors to think about how the smell is affecting their perception or whether the smell is affecting their perception, especially because it works against this long history of racial prejudice that associates Asians with bad smells, industrial smells, overcrowded smells, etc. The other Asian diasporic artist that I'm really interested in lately and have been writing about is Beatrice Glow. She's a Taiwanese American artist. In her exhibition that I'm writing about, I'm going to say it wrong, Aromatic Perfume, was exhibited in a gallery that's in a mall in Santiago, Chile. It really deals with the global colonial and settler colonial histories of scent extraction and scent exchange. She has these perfumes that she has concocted that feature smells of, say, black pepper or nutmeg. So, for example, the nutmeg really indexes the history of the colonization of the Banda Islands and the fact that those were exchanged for Manhattan, right? That England actually exchanged the Banda Islands for Manhattan because nutmeg was so valuable, and also that nutmeg was extracted through really brutal means. So she has sugar, opium, all these different scents that have hugely violent colonial histories and histories involving plantation slavery in the case of sugar and tobacco, for example. And she's kind of pulled them all into one exhibit that really sort of pushes visitors to think about the violence of this kind of olfactory sourcing and the way that violence was foundational for the so-called discovery and settlement of the so-called New World. The other thing that she works into the exhibition that I find really compelling is indigenous smells. So she visits a Mapuche elder who gifts her a couple of different kinds of leaves. I think one is called boldo, pilma is another. And then she puts them in an altar on the floor of the gallery. And so it's this completely different kind of olfactory relationship and display. And it goes right to the sourcing of the plants, right, which he did in a much more kind of direct, respectful, and culturally contextualized manner with the consent of cultural authority. So, yeah, I think of that as this kind of alternative to the kinds of smells and olfactory exchange that involve colonialism kind of through and through.
That was Hsuan Hsu, professor at UC Davis, and we'll be hearing more from Hsuan on future episodes, but be sure to look into his book, The Smell of Risk, if you're curious about how scent plays into xenophobic narratives and practices.
You are listening to Perfume on the Radio on Lookout FM.
Anicka Yi is an artist and the founder of Biography Fragrance. The winner of the biennial 2016 Hugo Boss Prize, Yi exhibited Life is Cheap at the Guggenheim, exploring her socio-political interest in the olfactive. Later, she showed the flavor genome at the Whitney and will take over the Turbine Hall in London later this year. Anicka has done a lot of work exploring facets of the immigrant experience and complex social networks, also from a feminist perspective. I started our chat by asking her how she came to use scent as a vital part of her art practice. Here's Anicka.
Oddly enough, I think that I started working with scent before I realized I was an artist, which I think is delightful because it was such a visceral kind of need to engage with odor, to engage with these compounds and molecules before I had a plan in terms of like, well, how does this fit into my practice? Or how does this work within the context of art history? Most people, when they engage with art, it's usually the ocularity that's activated. what was much more vital and urgent for me was through our sense of smell. It speaks to a very encapsulating sort of drive for me, which is I want a totalizing experience with art. Our perception of reality is really grounded through our senses. And so I felt like a lot of sort of modernism, this kind of like detachment, this sort of like studying art for art's sake, I felt that it was incredibly limiting. As biological entities, why would we limit ourselves to just vision in relation to anything, much less art?
Totally. So how do you relate this sort of sensorial activation to the topics that you were exploring?
When we can sort of point to how a lot of these sort of biological faculties and functions are conditioned through a very pointed value judgment and system, that these are not neutral biological functions. So, ocularity being associated with masculinity, discovery, knowledge, information. I think we've spoken before about how, these senses are ordered and gendered so that smell and olfaction has been related to the feminine because it's mysterious, it's inscrutable, it's immaterial, you can't grab it or hold it. And all of this is to make the connection that our biology has been colonized by these value judgments and that they are patently inaccurate. For me to make the connection with immigration, with systems of oppression and injustice, I think is a really vital area of inquiry. When you're dealing with olfaction, it becomes a transcorporeal exchange. The art doesn't get activated until there are entities that can inhale the molecules. And then it becomes this almost like collaboration of sorts.
I haven't ever thought of that in that way, but totally. You can't have an olfactory, component to your piece without someone to receive it.
No, and this is why air becomes this very, very critical medium for artists like me, and of course, we're still living in the age of this pandemic, and air is all anyone can think about now. And this gives us a lot of anxiety. And a lot of that is because when we think about air and how it functions, it is not it's not a judicious commodity that we are distributing fairly and evenly. Throughout history, especially during the rise of the industrial age, where the vast majority of those who were impoverished just had to inhale and live with the toxic air. And it still continues to this day. The disparity between the people who actually create the pollution and those who have to live and breathe the pollution. This is where you can foreground the immigrant being this figure that has done the work that most of us don't want to do, and the immigrant body being put into peril, into dangerous situations, whether it's inside the mines or in the nuclear power plants.
I'm also curious about your interest in your explorations of xenophobia as it manifests through olfaction.
Yeah, well, so, the Guggenheim show that I did in 2017 was sort of, I think this was a very springboard idea into the exhibition and definitely into the planning of the exhibition. 2016 was when I was awarded the Hugo Boss Prize, and that's the year that Donald Trump got elected. And that's when, he was proposing these Muslim bans. So I was in a very, I would say like a pressured zone on how to proceed and respond. Do I respond? Of course. This is what I do. I mean, my work exists in the world. It engages. It's in conversation with the world. I don't make abstract work that is in some sort of impenetrable subjective realm that just comes from my brain in isolation. That is a myth that I absolutely reject with art, that we work in a vacuum and that it doesn't involve the consideration of other entities and other beings, and that there isn't an accountability to that as well, And I say that in response to like climate change and everything we do matters. And that kind of accountability and responsibility is really important. So I was very nervous and I just thought, oh my gosh, what do I do? And I had a very visceral attachment to this narrative that was unfolding. And what we've seen the past 4 years is just unprecedented, staggering obscenity,
Mm-hmm.
Just obscenity.
Yeah, I mean, the flagrant xenophobia, the sort of cultural acceptance of xenophobia, and I'm thinking of from the beginning, but also, when coronavirus first hit, like the narratives coming out of the White House was this is China virus, Wuhan virus, it's like the basest of humanity.
Yeah. And I remember like early on, like people were saying, well, they call it the Spanish flu.
Yeah, it was also rooted in xenophobia, I mean, just because they did it then, that doesn't mean it's okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like, do we really want to uphold these values? Like, like century after century, isn't our goal to evolve? And that's the real question, Saskia, is that we're witnessing a de-evolution, right? For most people, that's what we would qualify this. Like, this is not okay. And my job is to really figure out why this is happening rather than just sort of, bemoaning the loss of rationale and reason.
Totally. I always see artists these days as sort of the modern philosophers, you're reflecting, and you in particular, you're reflecting these narratives back to the world, but using an unexpected approach, which is this sort of much maligned sense. So.
Right. Well, I mean, I definitely, like, my medium is philosophy. And I mean, this may sound a little harsh, but I think that artists have been very behind the curve in the last 20 years in responding and engaging with technology, with climate. I feel like there's been a lot of passivity there and just more sort of diagrammatic relationship to these issues rather than actively working through them and actually inventing and creating, if not co-creating, new systems. And this is why I think artists need to be just more vigilant.
Yeah, and unabashedly engaging in the politics and the reality, right?
Absolutely. I think prior to the pandemic, the definition of an artist is just, hit your mark. You're like a gymnast or something, right? You show up, you make these exhibitions, these galleries, these museums, you do a few extracurricular activities, and that's like almost kind of all that people expect from artists. And that is not good enough. Our job is not to just have relationships and interface with institutions that may or may not be questionable to begin with. Don't we want more out of art?
Yeah. Yeah. Is it complicated to use scent to communicate these ideas? I mean, do you feel like scent needs to be contextualized always?
I think that we are going to experience a new cognitive realm for olfaction because of so many different influential forces. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of dispelling the unknown, the myths, the sheer inaccuracy of what we know about smell. But then there's also a literacy that we need to work on. That's been very important for me in seeing the landscape and looking at other artists who are working with smell. Artists like Cecil Tolas, artists like Sean Raspid, there's a literacy that's taking place. The more artists work with something, the more that you're able to penetrate the void. Most people just don't think about smell, as you probably know, Saskia.
Yeah.
In fact, they are subconsciously actively avoiding it in the West, where it's like you're walking past a certain fragrant neighborhood and you're like, no, I'm going to hold my breath. Or like people are very sensitive, as they love to say. What does that even mean? Does that make you more biological than the next person? I think that it's really a psychological rejection and attack on a bodily function. This sort of like repression of like contain the animal, because smell is still so much associated with the shame that humans have that we were animal once. Modernism has taught us, no, we are no longer a part of the nature cosmos. We've left nature and we have created a dominion, a space that is purely human. And now we know that that's a ridiculous assertion, that there is no separation. And COVID, once again, has reconfirmed that there is no outside of nature, that all there is really nature, even with technology.
You touched on something very briefly. You said, people hold their noses, they walk through a fragrant neighborhood, and touching on that, and then on what you were talking about of us sort of rejecting our bodies. I'm also curious to hear your thoughts on how the embodiment of being human has evolved. Do you think that there's a change in how people are perceiving human odors,
I hope so. And it's my hope and my job, my duty to try to offer a path. I think that most humans experience a personal civil war every day in their bodies, Saskia, because we have this constant contradiction. We have this philosophy, this mandate, that tells us that we are not animals, that we are becoming less biological, that we are autonomous as human beings. And that undermines being in our bodies and how a lot of people feel the limitations of biology, hence like looking at robots and being able to have robots do the things that we don't want to do, like vacuum our floors. But I think that like there's a war that's going on with humans, that there is this sort of cognitive dissonance where they think, oh no, I'm special. I'm so much more than a plant or a microorganism or an animal and a machine for that matter. My role or my job, I feel like, is to try to undo that disconnect, that we should embrace that we are biological entities, that evolution doesn't distinguish us from a pangolin or a bat, that we have more in common, and that there are no crisp edges with evolution, that species that we overlap. So if we can embrace that, I feel like that we could have a much more robust relationship to smell and odor and our bodies.
Amazing. Well, Anicka, I don't want to take any more of your time. I think we'll have to have a secondary conversation down the line. But I really want to thank you for coming on and talking about these really important topics. That was the very amazing Anicka Yi. Anicka will be taking over the Tate Turbine Hall in October of 2021, so if you're anywhere near London later this year, make sure to go and spend some time there. Mary Richardson-Lowry is a former partner practicing in commercial transactions and government relations at Meyer Brown, an international law firm whose home office is in Chicago. During her long career, Mary also served in government in various capacities, but her passion for scent was always simmering, and it led her to team up with Brenda Mackenzie Singhal to co-found the Perfume brand Identity Narrative. Mary joined us from Arizona, taking a little break from her hometown of Chicago. Mary, it's a real honor to have you on the show. I really am super happy to have you here.
It is an honor to be with you today.
So I know that discovery and encountering difference is a really big part of how your perfume line came to be. If I remember correctly, you were on a trip when you conceived of the idea.
That is correct. I was in South Africa, or maybe it was Namibia at that point, because we were going in and out on the Zambezi River, different countries. And, or maybe it was Zimbabwe. Yes, all beautiful. We were navigating throughout the river, and I knew when I left for this particular trip, it was I needed to make some decisions. But that environment just helped me to settle myself, focus, and that we were on that cruise when it came to me that this was the right thing to do and the right time to do it in.
So that's, yeah, I mean, all our best ideas often come when we're exploring sort of unknown parts in a way. So that sort of leads to my question, which is how do you relate as a person, but also as a business person, to the idea of difference in people? And specifically when you make and release your work under an identity narrative?
The whole concept of the title of Identity Narrative was really built around the very question you've asked. And that is connecting with people across differences, across geographical boundaries, across class, across race, across sex, across how they identify in terms of their orientation. We wanted to have a fragrance line that spoke to difference. hence the title Identity Narrative. How do you identify yourself? If you are part of the LGBTQ community, there's a place for you in this fragrance line. If you're in Appalachia and a remote area, there's a place for you in this line. If you are a conservative woman and a progressive thinking woman or man, there's a place for you. We wanted people to be able to see themselves in all their iterations in this line. And we also wanted to try and convey that who I am today is not necessarily who I will be tomorrow, and not necessarily who I will be if the fact pattern of how I'm existing changed. And I needed to have a scent, a fragrance, or a series of fragrances that would carry me through my, what I hope to be, ever-evolving existence.
So it sounds like you really celebrate the idea of difference between people, but also difference within one person, the multitudes of our identity.
It is both. And I found, just by way of an example, we're based in Chicago, but when I'm in Arizona, I tend to morph a little bit into something a little different. I relax. I connect more with nature. I engage with people that I would not otherwise be able to engage with about things that perhaps I would not focus on if I'm in at the home base, if you will. And that being open to the new, being open to the parts of oneself is the voice through which this particular fragrance speaks. But I have to say, it emanates in large part from the founders. And we are ever-changing view of ourselves, of the world, etc.
Do you think that perfume can be a tool for self-expression and empowerment in this way?
I think it should be. But I recognize the person themselves has to be open to it. My grandmother used to give voice to, if you are static, then you're not open. If you're not open, then there might be an opportunity presented to you, small or large, that you don't capitalize on, you don't recognize, you don't embrace because you are not open. And I carry that with me. She said that to me when I was a child, probably because I was doing something that seemed to reflect a lack of openness as a child. But I carry that with me even through adulthood, and I believe it to my core. Fragrances can help us in a moment to deal with the unexpected, to deal with the expected, to create an atmosphere, to transcend a situation if we're open to it.
It sounds like you, well, with your grandmother's guidance, it sounds like you really internalized this idea of openness. Is there also a joy to that, to sort of engaging with the quote other, or learning about the other? Is there a beauty to encountering?
Oh, absolutely. Unequivocally, there is beauty. There is oftentimes depth. Just in the knowing and in the learning, there is beauty. But to have that exposure and then to walk away a fuller person with a body of knowledge you didn't have when you approached the situation, to put on a fragrance and feel transformed in the moment, or if it helps to prepare you for the next moment. By way of an example, preceding this call, I said to myself, I need something that makes me feel settled and happy so that I can convey both throughout this conversation. So I chose nomadic because I also, again, we spoke about the traveler and the connectivity, and nomadic helps me to think about those things, and it makes me feel joyous. And so I put that particular scent on preceding the call because I thought it would just help me to settle myself for this conversation.
Sounds like it worked. You seem settled and joyous and calm.
Well, in part too, it's your voice. So when we began, we spoke at a certain level, and we both now have settled in to this cadence, and it's pleasurable. Fragrances can help settle into a cadence that is pleasurable when you need it.
Isn't that amazing how we settle like that as humans with each other? It's actually, it gives me a lot of hope.
Indeed.
Well, Mary, as always, it's such a pleasure to speak with you, and I, happy travels, I think, is the only appropriate thing to say.
I thank you for the conversation. I thank you for the opportunity to share with you, and I look forward to more conversations with you.
As do I, Mary. That was Mary Richardson-Lowry, co-founder of Identity Narrative. You can learn more about the brand at identitynarrative.com. Well, that's about it, folks. I've been your hostess, Saskia Wilson-Brown, and it's been a pleasure to share the perspectives of our 4 wonderful guests. I hope that you got something from these conversations. I certainly did. Credits for this episode go out to Maxwell Williams for the snappy title music, as well as Stephen Rimlinger for the melodic interstitials. We also cannot neglect to thank Cameron at the nonprofit radio station Lookout FM, as well as our friends at Dublab who facilitated this show happening in the first place. This show is produced by the Institute for Art and Olfaction, which is a nonprofit based in Los Angeles, California, that's devoted to experimentation and access in the field of perfumery and olfactory art. You can learn more about what we do at artandolfaction.com, and of course on Instagram at artandolfaction. We chose music for this episode that was beautiful, calming, and crucially in the public domain. Feel free to check out the track list on our website at perfumeontheradio.com. We also would like to take a moment to thank Muse Open, which is a database of public domain recordings and sheet music, carefully selected and presented for the public good. Finally, this is our 4th episode, and if you're just catching us for the first time and want more, well, there's good news for you. We archive each episode once it airs on perfumeontheradio.com. We also release older episodes as podcasts, which you can download on a podcast provider of your choice and enjoy in a location of your choosing. I suggest an Indonesian beach or possibly on a nighttime walk in Havana. Our next episode will tackle vice, sex and substances and other things that are sometimes construed as problematic. We're having a devil of a time keeping it FCC safe, so fair warning, there may be a bleep or two, but we'll do our best as always. We look forward to sharing this episode with you then. And until then, friends, keep it kind, keep it real, and keep it smelly.
You're listening to Perfume on the Radio.
On Lookout FM.